Nearly 40 million Congolese are heading to the polls on the 20th of this month, with President Felix Tshisekedi seeking a second and final 5-year term in office. The elections take place against a backdrop of conflict in the East and economic and social crisis. For more on the upcoming polls, I'm joined by political analyst Musa Mdunge. Musa, appreciate your time. Let's start here. What role does the United Nations mission play in the DRC's upcoming elections, and why is there a request for assistance despite calls for their withdrawal?
Thank you so much for having me and to your viewers. So the United Nations, security mission there is a very key and will play a very key role in ensuring the security and the legitimacy of these upcoming elections. We know that the DRC is, from a geopolitical and an economical sense, a very strategic country and one that has been said to be very rich in natural reserves, perhaps one of the richest countries in terms of that. And so this country has been a hotbed for conflict for the past 30, 40 years, in fact, since its independence. And so right now, as the country gears up for these elections, having faced the period of COVID-19, the pandemic as it was, as well as 2 Ebola crises, Felix Tshisekedi, finds himself in a very difficult spot. Will he be able to consolidate power around himself, as he has done in times past? You will remember his ascension to power was very much due to the influence and the role played by the former government of Kabila. And since he has removed former Kabila loyalists or enticed them with political roles, he has been able to bring about some sort of reconsolidation in terms of power, besides the challenges he faces with the M23 rebel groups as they are supported by Rwanda currently.
So one of those significant issues is the insecurity in the DRC. And how do political candidates address it in their campaigns?
Well, of course, varying candidates will approach this very differently. In fact, many of them have made promises that if they were elected in power, that they would be able to get control of the military, empower the military, ensure that they provide the kind of resources required in order to return the DRC to stability and security. But unfortunately, this country is a hotbed mess. In many ways, it is because in the sense of its strategic role and placement on the African continent, we see various players in that region vying for power and control over resources, including non-state actors. And so what is interesting to me is that none of these candidates have presented a clear picture as to what will they do or how will they respond to the roles of non-state actors such as multinational companies, to the role of other external players in this particular conflict as the DRC finds itself. But more so, beyond that, what are the measures that they will put in to ensure that peace and security is a consolidated process rather than one that is at the hem and at the yes of the man in power. And that is very key. Often what we've noted in African countries is peace and security often depends on who is leading on top. And unfortunately, unless the institutions change and unless the country and its leaders have a vision towards how they build a sustainable future, then we will continue to return to conflict. And that's where I think these particular political leaders, as they stand for the presidency, have definitely fallen short.
Well, one of the biggest challenges, obviously, is security, which you mentioned, and there's been much talk around it. Currently, President Tshisekedi has terminated agreements or not renewed agreements with a number of countries, Uganda amongst them, Rwanda and so on, whose military forces were assisting in dealing with the M23 rebels and so on, but with little success. In what ways do you feel that the incumbent or whomever it is that takes over will need to deal with the issue of security? And is it one of those things that the young people of the DRC who make a significant number of the voters in this month's elections will be looking at?
Indeed, security is going to be a very vital thing for the DRC. particularly for these political leaders as they stand for these elections. You know that the DRC is home to a young population, a fledgling population, and one of the fast growing ones in the African continent of over 100 million people. And it will continue to play a strategic role in the African continent, and so will its people. And for the DRC, the question is, what kind of future do you build? And without answering the questions around peace and security, it is hard to fathom then the kind of political process, the economic policies, and the social policies that the country must then implement in order to ensure the conditions of economic growth and economic development are therefore met. And while the DRC is home to quite a substantial number of natural resources, it suffers the resource curse in many ways. And it has been a curse of its own, gift in that way. And unfortunately for the country, its inability to answer the question on security is one that will hinder it. And particularly on foreign policy, given the role of external players like Uganda and Rwanda, the question begs, are the leaders who are going to follow be able to deal both with the external and the internal pressures as they seek forth a peaceful resolution to this conflict and a better future for their people?
Musa, the IMF has only recently, I think in an article we picked up today, given the DRC something in the region of 200 million United States dollars. And that's literally on the eve of this election. Do we read anything into this transaction happening at this particular hour?
Well, we can read that there is definitely a reluctance from the IMF and from Western powers in viewing these elections as potentially being legitimate, free and fair, and where the results can be trusted as credible. Of course, it is a good thing that the IMF, even in the last minute, has decided to support these elections in the hope that the legitimacy, the credibility of these elections, and the quality of these elections will be assured, to ensure that, the voice and the interests of the people of DRC is expressed in its fullness, given the political and security challenges that the country faces in certain regions. One of the key stumbling blocks has been the issue of election funding. And this is a matter that has really been bogging the African Union for quite some time, with its leaders failing to really find each other in creating an election funding facility for African countries in order to ensure that, Africa is able to fund its own elections and does not therefore fall prey to the influence of external powers. And that's going to be key if Africa is going to drive its own agenda in its own economic and political revival.
So, let's take a look at some of those candidates that are contesting against Felix Tshisekedi. I think the last contender from the last election is primarily the most outstanding. Who else do we need to look out for?
Well, this election is very interesting in many ways because the kind of leaders who are there are ones that, have really been in the political fray. They have been part of the political system and in many ways do not present in any way a new or possible dispensation for the people of the DRC. I mean, you think of the fact that many of them are backed by former Kabila loyalists and the machinery of even the military playing a role in deciding who would be king in these elections. In many ways, this election is for Felix Tshisekedi to lose because he has been at the helm. To lose because he has been at the helm of the country and has really consolidated his power in terms of these elections.
Now, if they are to oust Tshisekedi, there's been talk of the possibility of these candidates coming together as a show of force and to either present one or two candidates as an option. Is this likely to happen?
Well, unfortunately in African politics, everybody wants to be king. And I don't see a situation that would happen unless there are political and economic agreements set. Unfortunately, when it comes to power, it is about who can have control over state resources. And in a country like the DRC, that becomes very important. And so while there may be some machinations of a possibility of that happening, it is unlikely that it will stand, given how fractious the political situation is there, and the kind of role and influences various external players have, and the buy-in and the stake they have in this particular conflict, makes it really impossible in my eyes that a unity candidate or a coalition candidate, for that matter, can be able, to take out the incumbent from power.
And final thoughts on the election landscape. Is this likely to be a free and fair election? Who are some of the observers that we can expect to go over and watch over this election in a few days' time?
Unfortunately, it is sad to be a pessimist on this one. I don't think that this will be a free and fair election to the highest degree. Of course, there will be pockets of excellence, but unfortunately, given the last-minute funding for this particular election, given the political and security crisis that the country faces, I don't see those observers from places such as the EU giving a favorable observation of this particular election. It will be interesting to see what the African Union and other African states will say about this particular election. Think of what happened with Zimbabwe, where you had for the first time really, the SADC region, calling the elections, calling the credibility of those elections in doubt, but nothing really happening to push for a change in terms of that country. Will we see the same happening in DRC? All African leaders stand up and really assert the importance for credible elections in order to ensure a process towards peace and security.
Musa Mdunge is a political analyst speaking to us from Soweto in Johannesburg. Appreciate your time.